Thank you very much. I'm David Danks, Professor of Data Science and Philosophy at UC San Diego. And it's really been a wonderful welcome that Washington State has issued to all of us. It's been great to be here. I have the honor and pleasure today to moderate a panel on something that I think doesn't necessarily come to many people's minds when they first hear the term DARPA, and that is the human domain, the human factor. I think there's a tendency sometimes to focus on the flashy technologies, the self-driving cars, the novel nanomaterials, and to lose perhaps sight of the fact that these are largely in service of human interests, human needs, and are constrained and shaped by the humans who use them, the geopolitical factors that were mentioned earlier this morning. And so it's critical for DARPA as it thinks about how to generate surprise, how to anticipate surprise, how to respond to surprise, to make sure to really focus on not just the physical dimensions of the world, not just the computational dimensions of the world, but also the human dimensions of the world. So with that, I'm really delighted to bring out two folks who are going to be joining us today. Sonia Schmerer-Gallander is a principal research scientist at Smart Information Flow Technologies. Her research interests focus on social and cultural aspects of ML systems and how human values, biases, and behaviors shape technological innovation. She's led a number of exciting projects within that domain. And prior to working at SIFT, she worked at the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Lab at Columbia University. Thanks for joining us today, Sonia. And Dr. James Evans is the Max Pelowski Professor of Sociology, Director of the Knowledge Lab, and Faculty Director of Computational Social Science and the Institute for Trusted Intelligence at the University of Chicago and the Santa Fe Institute. His research uses large-scale data, machine learning, and generative models to understand how collectives think, what they know, and how they interact. So thanks so much for joining us, to the two of you. We're going to start with some brief remarks from Sonia and then from James, and then we'll move into a moderated conversation.
Okay. Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Let's see if this works. Any of you recognize these faces? Well, you shouldn't. They have been generated by an adversarial general model. They are not human. They have no language, no values, no family, no friends. They don't get sick. They don't age. These are ones and zeros arranged in a specific pattern. It's technology imitating human nature, but it's also technology changing human nature. So for the purpose of this short talk, I'm going to use quotes from famous thinkers to make three main points. One, human identity is shaped by social relationships. Two, human performance is impacted by social relationships. And three, technological development largely depends on social relationships. The cosmologist Max Tegmark was talking about mathematics when he said that there are no entities besides relationships. He said that in the physical world, entities themselves have no intrinsic properties, but are entirely made of relationships. I say it's not that different in the human domain. It's this it's these social relationships that are very difficult to measure, that have kind of the quality of dark matter. But it's really important to pay attention to this dark matter and try to understand it. That's why programs like computational cultural understanding or Habitus are so forward-thinking, because it's a different kind of DARPA hard problem to try to build an NLP model of pregnant Muslim women in northern Nigeria with absolutely no digital presence. But that's exactly what we are doing by combining thick data with neurosymbolic AI. These kind of results provide us an understanding of a different kind of cognitive map that somebody uses when making decisions. It helps us understand who they are listening to, who they consult with, and how they make their decisions. That is human domain work, but it's also really crucial for national security. National security itself is made up of people, like many of you here in the room. Operators, commanders, strategists, computer scientists, hopefully also social scientists, and soldiers. And as Napoleon famously said, it is soldiers that win the battles. This image here is from a study I led together with my colleagues at SIFT and the Navy at the Hawaiian Space Exploration Simulation Analog Environment, or the High Seas Habitat. We had six high-performing individuals live and work together in confinement in a dome located on Mauna Loa, 8,000 feet above sea level. You see them here on a so-called EVA, or extravehicular activity, with spacesuits and helmets and breathing gear simulating the conditions of a lunar surface operation. This is not your average lab experiment. It's not a computer simulation. This is really happening. But this is how DARPA does team research. These kind of studies really help us understand the interconnectedness between sleep, diet, performance, cognition, and social relationships. We can look at the relationships between a cortisol response and the word that somebody chooses when writing in a journal at the end of the day. And this is also where AI is really powerful in helping us understand that social dark matter. So to an anthropologist in tech like myself, this is really exciting research. But to an anthropologist, AI is first and foremost a constellation of social and cultural practices. Maybe you recognize this image here called An Anatomy of an AI by Kate Crawford and James Flodon, that shows the interconnectedness, that shows the relationship between the human labor, resources, and data that is required to build the Amazon Echo device. It also shows us the interconnectedness of social and cultural practices. What you see here on the left side, for example, is the income distribution. I'm not sure you can see it here. Is the income distribution of everybody that is needed in order to build such a system, starting with the unpaid labor of an underground miner in Congo extracting lithium, up to the estimated $16,000 monthly of a monthly salary of the chief executive. It shows you the vast contrast of values literally placed on human labor. Systems like that work because of the human component, but they are also fragile because of the human component. So it's really important that we are paying close attention to the human component, because if the human component changes, the whole game changes. So my point is that technology and humans have always co-evolved with each other. Technology has changed the way we communicate. It has changed the way we interact. It has changed how, if, and where we meet. It has changed who we trust. It has changed what we value or what we pay attention to. It has changed our perception of national borders, but it also has changed warfare. These faces may not exist, but they are human because we created them. They look like they do because of technology that has been developed in the past. And frankly, they could be a bit more diverse, because the kind of images these kind of technology has been trained on is also based on the kind of technology that was used in order to create these images. So I want to end here by asking, or inviting you to think about, what are the human domains, what are the human components that we are touching upon as we are building technology for future generations? And how does that impact our technology, our humanity, not technologies? Sorry. Thanks.
James?
Thanks. So I'm also delighted to be here with you today. And I'd like to talk about a vision of how to think about measurement and prediction in the context of the human domain. Which facilitates modeling in a discrete way and in a continuous way. So in particular, I'm going to be thinking about the human domain as relating to the array of human brains and bodies engaged in communication and collective action. And so these yield structures of concepts and human relations, and these structures interact with other things. They rewire materiality. They engage and interact with geography, with technology, with the ideologies, et cetera. And in particular, I'd like to talk about what I see and have been playing with, along with a number of other scholars in this space, as a revolution in the way in which these are measured. Initially, we've been flooded with large-scale data about human culture and society. Cultural artifacts, text and speech, human-generated images and photos from a human perspective, human artifacts and technologies on the one hand. On the other, human social mobility traces and interactions and transactions between persons produce this enormous lake, this ocean of dependent data traces, which can be traced and have historically been analyzed as discrete topologies. The deep learning revolution and artificial intelligence in that domain has facilitated self-supervised models over these data to facilitate a representation of them in terms of continuous geometries. And this allows us to capture precise distance and direction, which allows us to predict in these systems of culture and society in ways which have been kind of unprecedented previously. In the example that I have here at the bottom, we've got 10 years of news, which is kind of auto-encoded by local word proximities. We induce a dimension, in this case it's social class, from a set of anchors that we anticipate. We project other words to that class, and we line them up with surveyed responses, and they line up with high precision. We're only missing about 4 or 5%, which likely corresponds to a mismatch of the population. So we're able to kind of identify and anticipate the ways in which these things work and the way in which they move. So if we think about the dependent data structures as links, these represent current actions and interactions between persons or between ideas, but distances in these continuous spaces that can be auto-encoded and learned represent the probabilities of future actions. So in this little social network up here to the left, insofar as the two people on the end have a new connection, a surprising or unlikely connection, if you continuously update those geometries, then you can predict the range of associated connections that are going to occur in the next moment. And if we take curvature into account in these geometries, not just thinking about them as flat Euclidean geometries, but taking into account hyperbolicity or the Euclidean, or not the Euclidean, but the spherical or elliptical nature of these things, we can actually model the degree to which individuals and concepts are together inside communities, which is to say they induce more connections in the future, or they sit across saddles, across communities, and they induce less. All these things suggest kind of this radical shift from a kind of Newtonian universe in which there's a simple geometry but really complex dynamics like gravity, to an Einsteinian universe where we've got a complex geometry but gravity and dynamics are trivial. They're just distances in this space. What do we do with these auto-encoded spaces? Well, one of the things that we can do that's relevant to a national security context is we can locate and predict disruptive emergences. So, for example, in this case, we're looking at basically building one of these manifolds that predicts the likelihood of current and future most likely interactions, in this case in the scientific space. What are the most likely combinations of elements that are going to show up in next year's patents and next year's papers? This allows us to invert that measurement to say, at the moment that something appears, its unlikelihood, the degree to which it disrupts the space and garners attention. And so this allows us to kind of predict and in a very timely way identify the degree to which something actually changes the structure of culture and society, and respond. Another thing that these kinds of data allow us to do is to merge very complex kinds of data to ask different questions. So in this particular context, I'm going to talk about merging social and cultural data to model cognitive availability, the likelihood that individuals are in places where they can think certain things at certain times. So as just a simple example, I've got a set of papers here. Each of the people who wrote the papers are represented by empty or hollow geometric blobs there, and then the materials that they're studying. And the properties of those materials are in the colored spaces below. If we run, as we did, billions of random walks over this hypergraph of space, and we encode those hypergraphs, then we're able to identify not only the things that are going to be discovered in the future, but the people who are most likely to identify those things, the people who straddle the materials and the properties in question. All this allows us to think about not only what's going to happen, but potentially who and where those things are going to happen inside a national or an international stage, in science and culture and elsewhere. All these things are just an effort to give you a sense of some of the measurement possibilities that are emerging in the context of these enormous, self-supervised models that have really been demanded from the supply of enormous data. And with this, I'll turn it back to you, David.
Thanks so much, James. And so we're going to move now to a sort of moderated, as always with these things, Q&A. So I encourage those of you, whether in the audience or online, please submit your questions because I'm sure there are a lot of really interesting ones that will come up. So Sonia, I want to start with a question for you. You're a social anthropologist by training, and you talked a lot, or hinted around and made clear, values play a really important role. The values that we bring to technology, the values we implement in them, the values in how we respond to them. But values are diverse. I mean, as a philosopher, we talk about value pluralism, this idea that you, even though we both live in California, you don't value things, you don't have exactly the same values as I do, and we wouldn't expect that. So how should we think about that when we're building technologies, when we're engaging in global conflicts, when we're working with allies whose values are not the same as ours? How should we be thinking about these challenges moving forward?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The short answer is work with anthropologists and listen to the locals. The more technical answer probably is by combining what I said before, like thick data with big data. So you're right.
Can you say a bit more when you say thick data? What do you mean by that? That may not be a concept you've used.
So it really means like high quality data. Like when in anthropology we talk about, like Clifford Geertz, I think that you had on your slide, has coined this term when we describe a culture. When anthropologists go out and describe a culture, they produce ethnographies. These are thick descriptions. These are qualitative descriptions collected over long periods of time that like contain a lot of details. There's depth in that data. That's very different from big data, which means like there's a large amount of data. So there's very little data that goes a bit deep, and then you have big data that can help you like identify patterns and like helps you, for example, with generalizability and things like that. I think you have to combine both in order to get insights into what values matter. So if we look at, for example, just the local level, I think there's NLP methods. For example, we have been doing this, for example, using like transformer-based NLP architecture in order to extract knowledge graphs. And they use the data that is there and help us reason about what is actually represented in the data. We use social theories in order to inform coding schemas that help us reason about causality, or that will help us extract causality. And that kind of causality is also in turn defined by other theorists, like philosophers like yourself, or like Tanya Lombroso, for example, has been fantastic in that field, Dan Dennett, where we look at qualitative causality, we look at functional relationships, we look at temporal precedence. We can extract all that from the kind of thick data that we have there, and that is a way to capture the values as they emerge in the kind of like qualitative descriptions that have been produced by the locals, ideally in their own language, right? Like we have like people that are working in Habitus. We are doing this with the Novanti group on a project led by 26, and we are working with the University of Michigan in order to develop like these cognitive maps. Like how do people that are very different than us think about these kind of issues, like maternal health in Nigeria, for example. But you also want to harness the power of big data, because you can take these smaller data sets where you have much more knowledge of who is actually represented or what's contained in that kind of data, and then combine it with the power of like big data and use that, for example, for training purposes. So that would be one way. Of course, there's a lot of diversity that you can't capture necessarily. And I could think of other ways of capturing or measuring that, but I will leave it at that.
No, I think that's a really great point. I mean, whether it's anthropology, sociology, philosophy, we can bring a lot of tools to the table, but the big data still matters. But also, the AI needs the human sciences, the social sciences as well. James, you were going to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, I think exactly some of the things that you pose become this measurement opportunity, where you can anticipate the degree to which, from either small data that you can use to bootstrap big data, or even your own expectations. These large-scale representations allow you to encode those things and algorithmically propose what's surprising. What's either surprising to me, or what cultures and values would be surprising to what other cultures and values with respect to things that they may not even be articulating in context as a result of the way in which everything else connects in these spaces. So I think there's a measurement opportunity here to take seriously different arrays of values and their consequences, their cascading consequences for surprise and difference.
There might, if I may add, there's also a risk of introducing bias, right, at all of those points when we think about our own worldview that we are imposing when we are looking at data. That there's this subjectivity,
yeah.
Subjectivity, objectivity problem. Thank you. Between how are we going to make sure that we are not seeing the kind of things that we actually want to see because they are familiar to us? When we are like identifying concepts that are actually embedded in language, words that we don't know, or abstract concepts even, I think we can also use the data as it emerges in its local context in order to identify that. And that is where, for example, transformer-based models are really good at, because they can help you look at the different kinds of contexts where a specific concept emerges. And then you can use pattern recognition in order to identify or even extract meaning. And that leaves the researcher out of it, meaning like there's no bias necessarily introduced because like you let the data speak. That is like a grounded theory approach that like anthropologists, or phenomenological approach that anthropologists have used a long time ago. But I think we can even like, scale that to some degree using AI.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think that raises is that there's a lot of discussion right now. I mean, we just heard it in the previous talk about bias and algorithmic bias and technology. And much of that focuses on, say, bias in the, where did we sample from? Did we sample disproportionately from lighter-skinned faces or lower-pitched voices? But in fact, the data itself can be biased by the ways that we measure, right? So if I'm trying to predict warfighter performance, and I use the commanding officer's subjective judgments of who's a good soldier, that's a source of bias that's coming into the data from the beginning. And so, James, I want to put to you, I confess when you were giving your talk, I don't know if this was shared by anyone else in the audience, I couldn't help but think of Asimov's Foundation series, right? That you are Hari Seldon, right? You're the person who's saying, if we just measure everything, we can understand how a society will happen. But of course, one of the morals of that series is that there are the unusual, the anomalous events. Yeah. And so when we think about humans, we often emphasize our creativity, our ability to do the surprising thing. Certainly in combat and in war, it's critical to allow for the possibility that the adversary is going to surprise us in various ways. So how do you think about these kinds of issues and retain space for the anomaly, the surprise, the unique, in the kinds of models you're building?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, what are we able to predict? I mean, this is like momentum predictions. As a function of the last thing that happened, what's the most likely next thing that will happen? So we're predicting the most likely sets of next things, the least surprising things that are happening in these spaces. And it turns out that, for most domains that we've observed, from conflict and war to science and technological discovery, most things are follow-on, momentum, highly predictable things that occur. The things that are the most important things, as you suggested, these black swan events, these things that are, you couldn't have predicted, because they're drawn from some enormous distribution of possible things that could have happened. And I think what these type predictions of the things that are the most likely to happen allow you to do is identify how surprising things are the moment they occur. And they allow you to update and recalibrate those models, because most things in the social world and the technological world are follow-ons of those surprising things that basically disturb or reshape the space. So for example, a new compound that's used to treat some drug-resistant cancer, for example, that works successfully. And then what happens is 95% of the research that follows on is like, okay, well, what are drugs like that drug that can be used to treat triple-negative breast cancer? To what degree does that drug treat the cancers that are near triple-negative breast cancer? It basically opens up what I'll call like a simplicial hole of possibilities that then become, the moment that thing happens, they all of a sudden become highly predictable. So yeah, so you can't, so one can't predict like the big, like pivotal events, but the moment those events occur, you can see beyond them.
I think what I will add is that we are not completely in the dark about human behavior. We actually know quite a lot. Social scientists know quite a lot. So if we go back to the values, if we're thinking about like making prediction about like humanitarian disasters, right? Where climate change, where are people going to migrate? So geography, people working in the geographical domain have like mapped out already using AI migration streams. In the human domain, we can like think about like, again, what are the kind of values, such as like, do people prefer, are resources more important, or are social relationships more important? And like thinking about like what actually matters to a specific group of people can help with the kinds of large-scale predictions in order to make these predictions a bit more accurate. So again, I think the human component piece here is like looking at the kinds of things that people believe, the kinds of values people hold in order to make these predictions more accurate. And maybe not just always be in the dark thinking like, well, the data only, without like a theory or without a social understanding is going to be, predictive of anything.
Yeah, and I'll mention just one other thing. It's, I think, along these lines, we also can build models of the likelihood that kinds of unusual events are likely to occur as a function of prior theory. They're, scaling functions and things. There's, you can see if there's fragmentation in ideologies, there's this opportunity, right, for something to emerge that wasn't available if things are coherent in the past. So I think there are also things that increase the likelihood that you're going to see change.
Well, and moving past the false dichotomy that people sometimes want to impose on the human and social sciences of, well, either you can predict perfectly or you know nothing at all. And as all three of us work on human and social sciences, we are familiar with the idea that, no, we can get better and worse predictions, but it's never perfect, it's never random. I think that's absolutely right. I'd like to turn to a question from the audience, which asks whether there are strategies for including what I think the question is really getting at is the ways in which there can be large group changes and developments in values and perspectives. So all three of us are parents of either teenagers or near teenagers. And the values that perhaps teenagers have now may be different than the ones we had when our cohort was at that age. So we do see patterns of change within communities, within societies, in terms of the group values that change over time within a cohort and change between cohorts. So how do we bring these kinds of changes, these kinds of developmental processes into our models in useful ways without being buried under combinatorial complexity?
Well, I think I'll just say, there's many ways to answer that possible question. One strategy is just to identify, what are ways in which these values change, right? So even if you can't tell the precise gradient of, the way in which like youth will change with respect to maturity, in, for example, science and technology, as we've measured it, but also in the context of ideological innovation, we see, like this strong reduction in novel configurations as a function of age. Why? I don't think it's just biological age, it's social age, I mean, basically, once you become well known for something, it's very unlikely that you'll be invited to a party to do something that you haven't done before, right? I mean, you're reinforced. And so I think there are things like this, gradients like, the degree to which, social and biological age confound the degree to which, so older persons in this space are much more predictable than younger persons in this space. So I think we can take, again, there's lots of uncertainty, but we can take these gradients allow us to dramatically decrease the nature of that uncertainty.
It's a really hard problem because it's a dynamic system and not a static system that we have. And if we take language again, like language itself is changing all the time. Like a younger generation, like you said, our teenagers are using a different language, and populations are changing language all the time. So you have to adapt or like update your model to those linguistic changes. Or like if you think about like technological advances and the use of multimedia and memes and whatnot, they haven't existed. So models that have been developed that have not included newer forms of communicative expressions are going to fail. It's a really hard problem that lots of people are grappling with. Even like the big tech companies like Google Translate, I've been talking to them a while ago. They keep trying to update, and they have certainly more resources available, updating their translation models in order to adjust for not only the meaning of words, but also changes in biases. Like we are undergoing now also like change in Western societies, changes in our own values with respect to, for example, gender identities. So this is very hard. This is a very hard problem to really like understand what's going on somewhere else outside of where we live. But that's why it's so crucial to have people that do understand the culture and locals involved in the process. There's something to be said about citizen science, for example, as well as a form to generate like really up-to-date data, which is needed to make these models more accurate and dynamic.
Well, so I want to do a follow-up, because both of you, the way you were talking about the models is in terms of prediction, in terms of understanding, which are sort of operations where you stand outside of the system and you try and figure out what's happening or what's going to happen next. But of course, we're humans too. We're part of the human domain. DARPA's activities are trying to support people operating in the human domain, where we want to make interventions. So we want to go beyond predictive and correlational information to causal. So can we do that in the human domain? And if so, is it, I mean, I would suggest at least part of it is the collaborative interdisciplinary efforts, because as you said, we know a lot about not just how to predict what's going to happen to a society, but also what are the causal mechanisms by which those happen. But this seems really important if we want to move beyond our models just being early warning systems, right? It's obviously valuable for national security to know here's an unstable community or nation, but we'd also like to help. And that's an intervention. So how do we move beyond just mere prediction?
Yeah, this is the next frontier, I think for deep learning models more generally, not just in the social or human domain, but also in the sciences and everywhere else, is how do we turn these complex correlational structures into causal agents. And I think, one of the things that these kinds of models can allow us to do is they can allow us to identify a much richer range of graded experiments or natural experiments which have taken place in the context of the data generating process that we can exploit to anticipate the likelihood that when this changes, in the presence of this, and this confounder, this outcome arises. But in the end, I mean, it's experiment. So the question is, can you simulate experiments through these large, I would call digital doubles of social systems? And I would say there's enormous promise and opportunity for doing that, for identifying, the cases that can be lined up to identify, natural experiments that occurred. But in the end, I think, this is the great value if you're actually running, these experiments with actual people in these domains. You can simulate them, you can do all these kinds of things, but there's so many unmeasured variants. But it allows us to kind of, I think, pinpoint what the expensive experiment we want to do is in a much more precise way.
Mm-hmm. I think we're doing that already with the transformer-based NLP that my working colleagues like Scott Friedman and Vasant Saranti are working on, where we are introducing, as I mentioned before briefly, where we are working with knowledge graphs and transformer-based NLP architecture, where we're doing a lot of qualitative hand coding in order to identify specific the semantic labels for objects or entities in a sentence, for example. But we are also looking at like how are these like related to each other. We have an architecture for that. We have been using this in a number of different programs, like also in the misinformation campaign, where we can identify causality and intentionality in particular to figure out, for example, who, when you think about like in-group, out-grouping in online environments, like who is harboring, let's say, hate or love towards somebody else. So I think we can already extract that. But again, the intelligence that needs to be introduced in these NLP models comes from other areas. It comes from philosophy, it comes from cognitive science, where this is not new. Like we have been thinking about like causality, and you know that, David, much more than I. We've been thinking about that for a long time, and we have like a large body of knowledge that we can draw from. When we think about causality, we can like really identify what does that mean. It's not, is it a functional relationship? Is there antecedents or precedents within a sentence or a larger like piece of text that we can identify? We can then use AI and pattern matching in order to figure out where is this causality present in a larger data set. Another way to do this that we are working on is we've been working with the word value survey, for example, previously where we have correlated big data analysis, the word embeddings analysis to identify gender bias in data, and then correlated with survey responses on the word value survey with interesting results. Now we are using the word value survey and actually turned it into a word value corpus. So we have used these questions and turned them into value statements, and now we are looking for textual entailment in order to see when we have a sentence that is representing a specific value on some topic, can we find like the kind of values in other pieces of text where this is actually matching? And that's another way to maybe not extract causality, but extract values from like text.
Yeah, but I think in the end, you're also suggesting that there are circumstances where you want to intervene in a novel way, which is to say, there's no context in the data that's present that you can generate a natural experiment. Like this experiment has not happened, and I think, as you say, these transformer and other models allow us to align things to simulate, novel perturbations. But in the end, we need to run experiments. This will allow us to more efficiently run those experiments. Well,
and I think in doing it in principled and more ethical ways. I mean, one of the projects that we're working on is using causal discovery methods to understand causes of surgical complications. Mm-hmm. And one of the great things is we have incredibly rich data of measurements of people during surgical episodes, mm-hmm. but there are enormous ethical concerns about changing practice. We have to really make sure that we are not going to make things worse for the patients if we, for example, change the ways that an anesthesiologist does their job. And so even when it looks like a purely technical problem, these ethical layers are still layering on top. And I think that also points to the data challenge, right? In the surgical theater, we've got rich data. In the habitus, you've got cortisol measurements, you've got diaries. But so much of the human domain is up here. It's not something that is measured, or it's something that is hidden because it's in another nation or in a company that is not disclosing what they're doing. So are there ways to augment or improve our data? I mean, you've mentioned already, Sonia, the idea of thicker data, actually engaging in anthropological or sociological investigations. Are there other ways to impute what might be going on that you think are valuable and are things people should know about?
I mean, it's certainly, we bootstrap, and this is the reason why people use things like, SBIRD and other transformers, where you take, small scale availability of resource impoverished languages, and you use them to kind of like warp the space, the biases, the conceptual system of like a resource-rich language, and but there's no question it's fragile. I mean, AI is built on large-scale data. When you have small-scale data, there are patterns of human language which are common across all human spaces, which benefit from these bootstrapping exercises, but they diminish the expectation of surprise. So I think just kind of highlighting the fact that there's no magic here. The thing that we can exploit is the fact that, human brains, human bodies, human communicative systems are conserved. They've evolved over the last few million years. That's short in evolutionary time scales. And so there's a lot of patterns that are common across all of them. But using a rich pattern to kind of boost the signal of a kind of like an undersampled pattern reduces, and makes slightly more fragile the patterns that are that undersampled pattern. So it's a challenge.
Well, I think we are not exactly tapping into the potential that is actually possible through technology yet. We are talking a lot about language, and that's where we're doing a lot of our research. But looking at other cultures, again, for inspiration, there's different ways of perceiving the world. I think we can use different forms of sensors. If we think about, again, like historical, if we go back into history as to how technology has augmented our perception through glasses or other modalities, I think there's a lot that we are not tapping into yet that can help understand what is going on in the brain without even bypassing the language itself. If I can think about I'm not the expert. I think a lot of the other people here in this room are the experts on trying to measure what's going on in the ear when I wave my hand. But I think this could, for example, be measured by just trying to hack a Wi-Fi system, for example. And I'm not saying we should do that, but or that there is oral traditions where people are encoding much more in sounds than for example in language. I think there's a huge potential, and thinking around again, as I said before, the combination of humans and technology together, I think of it as a collaborative and an augmentative relationship, and not necessarily as an oppositional one. And there's a lot to be gained when we are thinking about the complexity of human behavior, where language is an easier one to tap into, but I think there's a lot of other modalities, the kind of pheromones we give off and whatnot. I think there was a really interesting study in a movie theater a while ago that was published in Nature that has measured the pheromone levels in the audience depending on what was happening in the screen, and they could basically predict excitement just based on what was going on in a room, for example.
Well, and I think what that also points to is there are a lot of efforts on integrating data, but they tend to be, how do we take this large data set and integrate it with that large data set, as opposed to thinking about the technological challenges of integrating qualitative data with quantitative data. So even if both are big or both are small, how do we integrate the rich narratives with those observable measurements, and not just in a sort of hand bespoke way? Because I think right now that's a big technological, at least from my knowledge, that's largely an open question. I guess we keep hearing that we're supposed to pitch DARPA on things we think need to be handled. How do you integrate qualitative and quantitative seems to me a pretty big one. So we're running short on time here, so I want to pose a final question. And it goes to the mission of DARPA Forward, right, which is looking towards the horizon of national security. And so the question is, in some sense, a simple one. We're hearing a lot about technologies that sometimes augment, but also sometimes replace humans. There's sessions later today on autonomous systems that make it so humans may not even need to be there. So do we think that the human domain is actually going to be less important moving forward? Or is that a mistaken inference? So I'm curious to hear your brief thoughts about, do you think that technology will actually make the human factor less relevant or more? And Sonia, you're already shaking your head.
No, not at all. I think it's going to be more important. there's things that like technology and AI is really good at, and we can use that in order to outsource the things that we are not good at. We can augment our own work and behavior using technology. I know there's a lot of like fear about like technology replacing jobs and a lot, or doing autonomous systems, doing things that we are not in control of. I think a lot of those fears are actually human projections. We like project those onto a machine, but I don't think that that is justified. I do think that humans should and will maintain control over large technological systems. It's even more important that we really think about what that means when we are talking about the human domain. Like a lot of things we have been talked about previously, we didn't even touch upon our ethical consideration, or Kathleen was talking about trust into AI systems. These are like important domains that we have to focus on, because the technology is there. And as we've also heard, there's going to be limits to the kind of resources that are available to us when we're scaling technology. So going a bit more deeper and making the human domain expand on the human domain, I think is going to be more efficient in the long run.
James, 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah. So I think everything becomes human in this system, right? So the algorithms, the choices, the design decisions in these technological systems end up reflecting underlying cultural biases and conceptions, and so really analyzing these systems becomes analyzing an artifact of human nature and culture. And so I think actually, in the same way that you suggested that qualitative data and quantitative data are mixed, this becomes a situation when we're really analyzing the human domain through the array of technologies. So I think it becomes, we're seeing everything as relevant to the human domain.
Well, thank you so much, and join me in thanking Sonia and James.